So great. I'm opposite Adam Saxton. I don't care being opposite him. I just don't want to hear him. How's everybody doing today? Power BI folks, right? It's just all circles and charts and stuff. How's everybody doing today? Good? Yeah? You guys awake? Yeah. I have the enviable just after lunch session. So if you do go to sleep, I'll come sit in your lap. I promise that I'll do that. To keep us all awake. For those of you online, welcome to the session. Hopefully you can see the slides okay. Hopefully you can hear my voice okay. And if you do have questions, there's that tool that you can use. Those of you in the room can also use the tool, or just raise your hand and we'll sort you out. We won't chase the box around. We can do that, but I'm not going to do that. I'll just repeat your question to make sure that you do it, because it takes time to chase. It's a fun box, don't get me wrong, but it's just hard to chase around. So we're going to go through today Arc, and Arc. Microsoft is known for having some of the absolute best product names in the industry. Like nobody names products better than us. For instance, Azure. What does the word Azure mean? Does anybody know? It means blue. And when we say there's an azure sky, what do we mean? It means it has no clouds in it. We named our cloud after something that means there isn't a cloud. So anyway, we don't often name our stuff very well. And we've done that with Arc again. However, the premise is good. The Arc name is great. We've just used it in a few places. You'll see that change. We usually start out one way and then we merge together, so that will happen here as well. So we're going to go through some of what Arc is, and then I'll talk about what Arc is, and then I'll also at the very end cover off on what Arc is. And we'll make sure we know all of those, and then you can pick which one you'd like to implement if you want to implement it. And I'll kind of tell you where most folks are going that I'm seeing, and we can talk things through. Does that sound okay? Sound like what you wanted to do today? All right, good stuff. Does somebody have a count in the room? Will you get a count? The folks in the orange, will you get a count? Can you count it out? Okay, great. Just want to know, because my boss thinks I'm off on a vacation, right? So, but I'm not. Here's what we've got. We've got what we now call Azure SQL. SQL Server on premises is now counted within the Azure SQL team. We work on the Azure SQL team. Azure SQL is SQL Server. It's the same thing, same engines, all that kind of stuff. Different features, obviously. Different DMVs. I'm not going to let you get down to the hard drive in Azure, but I'm not going to let you mess with memory in Azure, but you have the same everything else. Your Transact SQL will run in all those places. So the first thing you need to know is SQL Server and Azure SQL, same thing. If you hear the Azure Data Team, that's the folks that both write SQL Server and all of the Azure SQL variants. So let's talk about this a little bit. What does it mean to have SQL Server in Azure? The first thing it means is you can have a virtual machine. Okay? So I like to talk about things in terms of abstraction. So if you want to go wherever you want, whenever you want, from your house to somewhere else, what do you buy? You buy a car. But you own the car. You got to put gas in it, you got to put oil in it, you got to put tires on it, you got to license it, you got to pay all the fees, but you can go get ice cream at 2 in the morning if you want to in another city. Ultimate control, ultimate responsibility. That's an on-prem system. You own it all. It's your problem. Make sense? Go like this. Okay, good. A virtual machine, we are all familiar with this from before. A hypervisor is a layer inside a computer that actually emulates another computer. And it actually does that really just by time slicing, and it does the big 4, CPU, memory, disk, and network. It represents your physical attributes into a logical layer so that you can then install an operating system on it, and that operating system thinks it's on a physical computer. We're all familiar with that. Been doing that a long time. I've been doing it since mainframes, but PCs have been doing it for a very long time. Hypervisor, VMware, those kind of things, yeah? Good to go? All right. We have SQL Server virtual machines on Azure. We also have just regular old everyday virtual machines, and then you can install SQL Server. That's not what I'm talking about here. You can actually go to Azure, click on a SKU. That's a way you buy something. And one of those is SQL Server on Azure virtual machines. What you get here, if you're rehosting something that needs not the hardware, you don't want to control the hardware, but you do need to control the operating system. You need to control the operating system. By the way, you should never need to control the operating system, but we do. It's just the way things are written. We'd like for vendors not to make me. Has anybody ever told you our SQL Server has to be on its own system? Anybody tell you that? Okay. And by the way, it's this version. And you're like, that's like 3 versions back. Anybody in that situation where they make you go like 3 or 4 versions. It's awful. And you're like, just test it so I can move to, I've been on Windows 95 a really long time. Can we move on? All right. We also have some things that we add on top of that. So you click this, you get SQL Server automatically. You give it a few parameters, passwords, names, networking, things like that, and off you go. You've got a SQL Server running up in Azure. What you get here are automated manageability and elastic scale features with operating system level access. So that's the kind of thing you get. We call this IaaS. We're all familiar with this process. Amazon has it, we have it, everybody else has it, and so on. We add some agents and things on top of that virtual machine, and it's in our fabric so that we can do backups and things a little easier. And so we've got all kind of goodness there for you to do this. If your application needs full OS control, this is a great option. However, we also have people that have told us, we don't want that, I just want a database. I've got an app in Azure or somewhere else, and I just need a database. Can't you just give me a database? It's a SQL database though, and I want you to figure out upgrades. I want you to figure out triple redundancy. I want you to figure out all those things. I don't want to patch an operating system. I just want a database. That's like taking a bus, right? You don't do anything, you just get on the bus and go where you want to go. That's the opposite end. That's SaaS or even PaaS is what we call it, platform as a service. We take care of everything for you. But there is a logical server, okay, but you can't really do anything on it. We do to you what you do to your developers. You know how you just give them a database and they ask you for stuff and you're like, no. We do the same thing to you. You get a database, you're good to go, and you're like, can I make the hard drive to, no, we're not letting you do that. You just get, here's your database. And that works for a lot of things. By the way, none of these are mutually exclusive. You can have one and you can have the other. And that's the way you should be thinking as an architect. But then people told us we want, because people are always telling us what they want. You know, we give them something and they're like, well, this would be great if it had whipped cream on it or whatever. So we did the Azure virtual machines and they said, yeah, that's awesome. Now I have to patch everything and I have to do all this stuff. What about redundancy, and what about high availability? And I have to build all that myself. And we said, well, what do you want? We made this other thing. And I don't want the other thing. So we said, okay, great, no worries. We've got something called managed instance. So if you can think about abstracting out the hardware, that's IaaS. That's virtual machine. If you want to go one level past that, you still need the instance of SQL Server. Anybody need me to define that word? Raise your hand. Okay, instance. Okay, so when you install SQL Server, we call that a SQL Server on a piece of hardware. But that's not really true. That's actually something called an instance, because you can actually install SQL Server multiple times on the same system. Those are called instances. And you come in at that level normally, and that's when you right-click and you actually see the instance name and all that fun stuff, okay? So that's the way that one works. So you've told us, well, I don't want the operating system, and I don't want the hardware, but I do want all of SQL Server. So we came up with something called managed instance. All this is going somewhere. We'll make some sense out of this in just a minute. And basically what we do with this is you don't have to worry about upgrades, you don't have to worry about those kinds of things. We take care of redundancy things for you. We automate a bunch of things, let you ship it around, all those kinds of really good stuff. So that's the middle ground. So you've got everything you kind of need here, mostly. But we've left a couple of things alone. And number one, we've left alone the on-premises system. You still got your hardware. Maybe you are running a virtual layer like a VMware or whatever, but we've kind of left those alone. You're just on your own with those. So you said, I really like my on-premises server. I really like my on-premises instances. I really like my on-premises databases, but I still want some of the Azure stuff. And we're like, oh my gosh, what do you want? And they said, okay, what we'd like is all that stuff, but then we also want Microsoft Defender. Has everybody heard of Microsoft Defender? Okay, we used to call it Azure Defender. Did you see that? And we renamed it. Just so you know, we do have some method behind our madness. When it says Microsoft, it's on-premises and in Azure. When it says Azure, it's in Azure. Does that make sense? Don't ask me. We're not consistent yet. We'll get there. But we renamed it to Microsoft Defender. Why? We have Defender on premises. But what do you have to do when when you got virus scans and protection stuff on premises? What's the first thing that happens on your system when you boot it up? I'm getting the updates. So for a period of time, you're unprotected with this security stuff. You're kind of laying there and you don't have the very latest stuff. We have to do it. We have to test it, we have to push it out, and you have to get it. That's what has to happen when this works this way. So we said, hey, we've got this ability to put everything in one place, Azure, and we could give you all the latest virus signatures. We can give you all the latest stuff if you could hook to Azure, but just for those things. So we said, okay, great. So you basically want Defender, but you want it on your physical box. Yes. We also want inventory. I'm sure all of you, don't raise your hands because, some of you, you've got your company name on your badge. I'm sure all of you know exactly where all of your SQL servers are at all times, right? Go like this. You're just lying. You're lying so hard. Now, no, maybe you do. Most of us don't. People install Express and do all kinds of stuff all the way. So you said, I want inventory. I want to know what I've got. I want to know what's licensed and what's not. I want to know what edition it is. I want to know what version it is, and so on. So I say, okay, great. You want Defender, and you also want inventory. Okay, what else? And they said, that best practices analyzer thing. Have you guys ever used BPA before? Anybody in here? Okay. This is a tool we have that you can run on your SQL server. And it takes all of our support cases from CSS, our customer support, and it runs across your server and says, these are some patterns that you're supposed to be using and you're not. And here's what you do to fix that, right? It's a really great tool. But once again, it's somewhere else. You download it, you run it, and so on. You're like, I want the best practices analyzer too. Like, oh my gosh. So you wanted some things like this, but you want it on your on-premises systems. And we came up with not one, but 3 solutions for you. They're all named Arc. All right. What is Azure Arc? We've got some Azure data services that you can run anywhere. On-prem, in Azure, or if you've made the poor decision to run a virtual machine in another cloud product other than Azure, we'll run it there too. If it's SQL Server, we'll run on it. How's that sound? Okay. Next, we'll extend some of the Azure management across so even if it's on brand X cloud, we can still inventory it for you. We can still keep it protected and that sort of thing. We'll do that as well. And you can adopt some of the cloud stuff we have, some of the best practices and so on, and the protections down locally. And then you can also implement Azure Security Anywhere. I don't know if you've seen a session yet, but you need to on Defender, where we'll actually catch a SQL injection attack attempt, tell you where it came from, and tell you the T-SQL to write to fix it with pointers. It's a thing of beauty. People keep telling me, I just want security so hard. I do cybersecurity a lot. People like, don't you just have a button? This is the button, okay? So here we go. So Azure Arc, this is the marketing. Azure Arc is a set of technologies that extend to Azure management, enables Azure's services to run across on-premises, multi-cloud, and edge. But that's basically what I just told you, but in a different way. Make sense? Everybody's super clear now, right? Okay, good. Stay with me. I'm trying to lead us up to this now. All right, so let's talk about it first. Basically, we have a few options for doing this. So these are big buckets from Azure Arc. Forget SQL Server for a minute, just Microsoft Azure Arc. So you can take an agent piece of software, you install it on your Windows server, right? You install it on your server. Oh, you can also install it on Linux. So you install this agent on your server and you start getting some of these cloud features, things like the inventory and the protection and so on. So we went one better. We said, no, Windows. Hey, we called the Windows team. Hey, whoa. We have stuff we do that's different than what you do. We have more. DBAs need more, right? So they said, fine, here's the agent. You do with it what you want. So we hooked into their agent and we add some more stuff on top of that, which gives you things like governance and security for your SQL assets. So it understands SQL. It's an agent, piece of software. You install it, network channel, certificates, money, and you're done. Okay? Next, we have something called Azure Arc Enabled Kubernetes. I'll talk about this at the very end. How many of you are not familiar with Kubernetes? Go ahead and raise your hand, loud and proud. Okay, good. We'll go over what it is in like 2 or 3 minutes. You can put on your resume after this. And then there's obviously deeper dives. My friend Ben Weissman, who will be here Friday and Saturday, I think, is doing a session that's going to dive far deeper on this one. I'm going to dive today a little bit on the middle one. Sound okay? So if you are interested in this, go check out his session as well. He's also written a book and done some courses. Really bright guy. He's not the real BW, though. So he's Ben Weissman, because the Germans, they say V, and I'm Buck Woody, and Bob Ward thinks he's the original BW, but in fact, I'm the original BW, just so we're clear. All right, questions on this itself so far? Everybody good? It's okay. All right, when do you use this? I love these things, don't you? The little charts you follow. So where do you want to use it? Do you want it in Azure, or do you want it like on premises, right? So if you want it in Azure and you want Microsoft to manage it, what do you need? Full instance, more control, use managed instance. I just need a single database, use Azure SQL DB. I want a shared pool of resources for multiple DBs. Elastic pools, Azure infrastructure over there. What if you want to manage it yourself? It's not in Azure and you want to manage it. Then you're going to do Azure Arc Server or Arc enabled whatever, in our case data services, and you can use anything you want where Kubernetes runs. Yes, sir, in the back. The question was on the Azure Arc enabled for Kubernetes or Azure Data Service in our case, the server that's running all that, is it Windows or Linux? Kubernetes is Linux. So the question was the containers that are inside the pods, which are inside the cluster of Kubernetes, what is that? It's Linux. The container is Linux. So the question was for the high availability for Arc enabled data services, what is that? Because Kubernetes has that built in. And SQL has high availability built in. Which one are we using? Yes, we're using both. We actually lit up to where SQL understands the Kubernetes high availability, and they work together, and you can do resource groups and so on, and availability groups right inside Kubernetes. We'll come to that in a bit, and Ben will cover it in far greater detail. Good question. Kubernetes is its own bear. So let's jump into, first of all, the Arc-enabled SQL Server. So here we go. We've got the Azure portal. You got your firewall. You're going to bring down an agent, piece of software. You install it. Then that gets lit up into the SQL Azure Arc extension because we've got the Arc agent and then the SQL agent for Arc part of that. And it wanders across and it installs a monitoring agent. So there's three things going on there. Once those get laid down, and this can be on a physical piece of hardware or a virtual machine, but it thinks you've got an operating system somewhere because we're installing a driver on it. Once it does that, you give it some ability to talk. It talks back and forth. It runs down to the Windows or Linux, event logs and perf counters, whatever they happen to be. Linux is different than Windows for perf counters, but we know that. So we grab the SQL event logs, and then we grab the Windows event logs or perf counters, and we shove those back into, all that stuff back up into Azure. Now what you've got, we don't take your data, by the way. We don't back up your data or anything like that with this agent. That's up to you. We never grab your data. But you have your inventory up there, and you have your log analytics up there, so you can see this stuff. We also have Azure Defender there, and it sends down the latest virus stuff. It's checking, it's doing threat conditions, all that. And then we also have Sentinel, which is watching for active threats. It's amazeballs what you get with this. You could do virtualization or your own infrastructure on that. Questions on sort of how it gets deployed? Two ways. First way, when you're installing SQL Server 22, SQL Server 2022, it actually has a little box there. Do you want to make this an Arc system? Click, you're done. That's it, you're done. Now you have this. It's going to ask you your Azure subscription, it's going to ask you your firewall stuff, and Bob's your uncle. If you've already got a server, then there's a page that we have that shows you every step you need to take. Somebody had a question right up here. Yeah.
The monitoring agent, is it installed on each SQL Server instance, or is it a man in the middle?
The question was on the monitoring agent, is that each SQL Server instance, or is it a man in the middle? It's a man in the middle for the actual agent itself. What it watches is each of those particular instances. To answer your question?
Yes, one to many.
Yes, sir. Okay, great. Everybody hear that question and answer? Okay. All right, so this is how it works and what you get. When you do this, here's kind of I just kind of walk through setting it up. This is the connecting to Azure part. If you do check that box, or you come in later and say, I want to install Arc for SQL Server, you'll download a piece of software, it starts, you get this little page here. You can just see here, it's asking you for your subscription details to Azure. Notice it says what kind of system you got. We run on, did everybody know we run on Linux? I'm assuming by now everybody knows that SQL runs natively on Linux. It's not an emulation, it's natively on Linux. And we support the major distros. Okay, I'm assuming you know that. So you fill this stuff out here. Always good to use resource groups. If you don't know what a resource group in Azure, whip out your pencil, take a note, go learn what resource groups are. You'll want those. It's a way of grouping your stuff together, make your life very easy. If you have a small Azure sub, a lot of times you just don't bother with all that stuff. Bother with it. Trust me. It's nicer to shut things down and get rid of things. Next thing it'll do is once you're inside, the first thing you can do is run a best practices assessment. Okay, would y'all like to see all this stuff? You want to see it? All right, let me pop over. We're going kind of, not off script, but let me do the, there we go. Oh, and it's locked me out, hold on. My password, just so you know, my password, I always set it to incorrect. And that way, whenever I forget my password, I just type anything and the thing says your password is incorrect. So it's a way, that's just a tip if y'all want to use that. All right. And it's trying to give me Windows updates. Don't you even start that. All right. All right, so here's my SQL Server instance. I'm not going to zoom in. It's Management Studio. It's the typical databases stuff and so on. What I'm going to show you, though, is over here, I've run that particular setup. When I built that server, I said, I want to be on Arc. And it said, OK, hold on. And it did everything, and here it is. So now, hopefully you can see all this well. Everybody see OK in the back? Okay. I'm just going to pop into my system. That system that I'm clicking on in Azure is on my laptop right now. Just so we're clear, the things I'm clicking through here and controlling and doing all this stuff on is not in Azure. It's on-prem. All right. So it comes through here and tells me all kinds of things I can do. I can see my Microsoft Defender for Cloud. I can see my best practices assessment. I have a very small laptop. My boss won't give me a real big laptop, so you can see that we've got these assessments. I can run one here. I can configure one. There has been one that's been run before. Hopefully it hasn't fallen off. It's just going to take a second to paint. There they are. And you can see some of them. It says, hey, look, this data has expired, and this one's scheduled, so that's going to run later. Let me pop over here into data expired. Click on that one. It's going to take just a second to come up if it allows me to come up. Will it allow me to come up if it's expired? Do you know? Dinakar, do you know? Will it allow me to come in if it's expired? It may not. At any rate, what comes up is the best practices analyzer with all the screens that show you, hey, you're letting DBO do these things, and you don't have a password on this user, and your databases haven't been backed up in 5 days. When you click on that link, it tells you all those things that are wrong and tells you what to do about it. Gives you remediation steps. And in many cases, it will actually say, do you want me to fix it? And you can click a button and it will. Now, I like that the button's there. I don't want it just going out and fixing stuff, because sometimes I do bad things because I have to do bad things. You know, that's how it is, right? But most of the time, I'm trying not to do bad things. So now, personally, I get, if I have a system like this that's under Azure, because I work at Microsoft, it will cut off my SQL Server if I don't conform to the right security permissions. But in your case, you'll have the ability to go through that. We also have, as we talked about, oh, by the way, you also have Azure Active Directory, so I can get single sign-on with multi-factor authentication, like the phone calls and that. I can get that on my on-prem SQL servers. So I've got an identity that I've done already for everything else, Office 365 and so on, and I can just say, oh, let Dinakar into that particular server, and I can just go get his Azure Active Directory. He gets a prompt, boom, on his phone, click, and he uses the app. And your security's handled. That is just really impressive. You have a question? We have a question from one, because it's not showing up here, so you'll just read to me. All right, go for it.
So as a user and customer of Azure services, you see the console, the web interface through which the services can be provisioned and controlled. Can you give us some information and insights into how the backend is structured and how Microsoft operates it? Do you use clustered Hyper-V nodes as we know them? Do you use System Center Manager with runbooks for deployment?
Yeah, great question. So the question is around what do we do? I mean, this is great. I get to see all this stuff. What's behind the curtain? How do we do this? We actually have videos and so on. If you go into docs, believe it or not, in the fine documentation, we've got videos like you can get all the way down to a data center tour to find out how that's done. As far as how each system is classified, we can give you more information on the docs. We're not going to have time to cover it today, but I've got all the references. By the way, I forgot to mention, I'll give you these slides, and I use the notes view in PowerPoint. Anybody do that? So I have all these links of everything I'm doing in the notes view, so you can follow along at home. So I'll get you a PDF of that if you want it. Great question. So now what I can do, not only that, I can also go to Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Keep in mind, this system is on-prem. It's not in Azure. So I get all of this stuff. You can see I've got all kinds of problems here on this particular thing. Not surprising, because I just set it up and moved on. This one says, SQL servers on machines should have vulnerability findings resolved. So I click that, and I'm like, wow, what do you mean? And it says the master database has an issue, and it's failed 19 of 58 checks, and it's kind of a big deal. You've kind of got a problem going on here. I'm like, wow, what do you mean? What kind of problem do I have? And this is, we got all kind of problems. You've got SQL logins with commonly used names. You've got database owners are not as expected. You've got the SA login enabled, and so on. Not only does it have this, you can set benchmarks. We have benchmarks you can apply for European, US, and Asian requirements that your government calls you for, and you can make your own. You can make your own requirements and say it must have this, it must do that, or it violates my policy. I pop this out to an auditor, and I've got my audit report. Things that used to take us a very long time to create in SQL are now just right here on the screen. And if you click one, I'll click one. I'm not going to say go, though, because we'll stop the demo really quick. We don't want to do that. You can see it says, here's what you could do. Here's how I found it. And here's how you could fix it, remediation. So the top there says just alter your login, just get rid of SA, you'll be fine. If you're having any problems with your computer, just unplug it and then problem solved. So don't do that. But this will tell you what you can do once you've taken your steps. It also shows you how it found it. So the behind the curtains question we had earlier, we're trying to do a lot more of that. Like, what did we do to make that true? Does everybody see what's going on here? And you see how handy this could be for your on-prem servers. So it goes, and by the way, you can see down at the bottom, add all results as a baseline. And you say, you know what, that's cool. I'm fine with that in my company. Add it as a baseline. Don't tell me anymore. You can do that as well. Not a great idea for a FedRAMP thing. That's a federal government thing. But it explains kind of what's going on. It also has down at the bottom here, let me try and scroll down. You can see that it's not currently in a baseline. It would still show you that it had been detected, but would leave it as a baseline. Does everybody see kind of what's going on here? You just drill through. There are reports you can have, and you can also use log analytics to go search your logs, and you can search all of your logs, the KQL language and so on. You may have seen that for your Azure folks to do other things. Now you could tell them, yes, sir, in the back. The question was, are you done? Okay. Well, the question was, when you deploy this, is there a performance hit? No more than standard monitoring. And now you can monitor to where you get a performance hit in any monitoring tool. We don't do that out of the box. You can add too much if you want to. We don't do that to you. The neat thing is these things are happening kind of in a periodic fashion. These audits are being done periodically. You can schedule them. By the way, you saw my schedule that hadn't gone off yet. So I can schedule it whenever I want during my downtimes, or at least my least downtimes, and so on. That then pulls up into Azure. Everything you're doing in Azure, not touching the server. This is all up here. So let's go over there. You had one over here. The question was, can I write my own queries and run them across all databases? Instances. Instances, no. I can tell you another way to, you're looking for something called policy. We'll talk about that later. Yes, sir.
What kind of logs are being exposed to the log analytics vectors? Only these assessment logs or all the SQL and agents?
Yep. Great question. The question was, wait a minute, what logs are up there? Are only these things, or can I see anything? See anything? Yeah. You get your SQL event, you get your SQL logs, your standard SQL logs, and then you also get your Windows perf counters or Linux perf counters, and you can marry these across all of your instances. Once the log analytics things, all kinds of fun stuff you can do with that. Does that answer the question? Anybody else? Good questions today. Okay, does anybody think this might be useful? How many of you have used System Center before? Anybody remember System Center? I remember Hermes, which was the System Center we bought back in 1994 at Microsoft. System Center is a great tool, lets you set a big box in your enterprise and then manage. It does a lot of this kind of stuff, but it needs a full-time set of administrators to run. This is very similar in concept, except we're your system administrator. That's taking care of the logging and so on. Does that make sense? Yes, sir, in the back. Is there, okay, the question was, if I understand it correctly, I've got like 1,000 servers in my enterprise. I want to do all this at once. I just want everything to be registered into the agent. We do have scripting and so on where you can do that. It would be just like any other scripting event, and you can use the Azure CLI. Okay, and you can also use the Azure CLI to then look at your logs and your events and all that if you're a command line person. Great question. Other questions? Yes, sir. So the question was, what if we already have Microsoft Defender on-prem? That's being migrated to the Azure one anyway. So this would step on that and you'd get this. And the Defender just lights up and says, oh, you've got SQL, and adds more rules. Yep. It's actually the threat assessment that's really SQL focused. Do you have a question here?
If I look at the Azure pricing, the hours in there, are these the hours the server is switched on in the month?
Okay, the question was when I look at the Azure pricing and the hours, so we need to be careful here. If we're talking about on-prem, you're not paying for your on-prem servers. We're not charging you SQL Server money for that. We are charging you for the inbound and outbound and for this service that these audits go and so on. The Azure servers, if this is applied across those, is just billed like it always is. There's no difference there, but then this thing is added on. Yes. It does have hours as an input. It's how long the ARC is running on that system, but it's not running all the time. You schedule these things to happen, but you're going to pay a fee for it. It's not free. I would love for it to be free, but my kid needs to go to college, so sorry. Other questions? Great question. Okay. All right. And if I miss you because I can't see, just keep raising your hand. All right, we need to get back to slide land. So that was the best practices assignment. You can see here I did one of the Defender slides. I'm going to bypass that because you just saw that. It's just kind of nice to have it. All right, now let's pop over to managed instance. Everybody kind of feel they understand what managed instance is now. So I'm not going to give you the operating system, but I'm going to give you the instance and as many databases as you want to make on that. Okay? Okay, good. So the difference between this one is we've got two. We've got Arc-enabled SQL managed instance and Azure Arc-enabled Postgres SQL hyperscale. So if you're doing Postgres, we'll also cover that. Notice down at the bottom it says any hardware, any Kubernetes. If you are K8 CNCF compliant, we will run on it. So if you are standard Kubernetes distros, we'll run on it. We don't care what vendor you're running. We don't care your hardware. We don't care, because Kubernetes is abstract. Does everybody know what Kubernetes is? Anybody want me to cover Kubernetes really quick? Let me do that? Okay. And maybe containers while I'm at it? Containers? Okay, I'll cover both. So when we're looking at a server, we have CPU, memory, disk, and network. That's physical. On top of that, we put an operating system, like Microsoft Windows, as the good Lord intended. Then on top of that, you begin to add other software. Is everybody with me so far? It uses the memory, the big four, and it does work. We came up with hypervisors, which says I'm a layer on top of hardware, but I look like hardware. And so I present to an operating system installer, oh yeah, I've got a CPU. Yeah, and I've got a hard drive and it's a network card. I got all that stuff. But in reality, it's sharing the one you have. So you can stand up lots of servers, but now you own the operating system and so on. So this one could drift from that one and it's a mess. So they came up with a new thing called containers. And this is an artifact of a Linux operating system. So containers only work in Linux. We fake it out in Windows, but it only works in Linux. And the idea is it is not representing CPU, memory, hardware, and disk at all. It uses the one you have. But it tells an application like Python or SQL Server, you've got a little space that you live, and you're on a computer. Don't worry about it. And they're very small, and they're very fast. In SQL Server, I can stand one up in less than 3 minutes, and I can upgrade SQL Server in about 47 seconds. I kid you not, and that's with a complex database. They're great. If you don't know about containers, go learn. But what do we do when something's easy to do? We do a lot of it. That's why you have a lot of things going on. So we have thousands of these containers. So, oh my gosh, now we've got to wrangle these things together. And so somebody came out, Google, with Kubernetes. And Kubernetes, which they shortened to K8s because there's 8 letters in it. So they named it and then said, wow, that's a long name, and changed it. And I'm like, just start with the short, but whatever. So they came up with this idea, and what you do is this. You've got your container, and you could have more than one container. And you group them together in something called a pod, P-O-D. And inside this pod are 2 special things. I know I belong to other pods or with other pods, and I have a networking layer of my own. And I have something where I can connect to storage somewhere. It's called a volume. So now I've got this pod, and I can have another pod, and I can have another pod, and I group that into something Kubernetes calls a cluster. A cluster. So a group of pods is a cluster, and a pod holds 1 or more containers, and a container is just an app. Everybody with me so far? Did I lose anybody? All right. So when they want to share data, they have this little claim, just a number, that goes out to hard drive somewhere that has that same number, and it's like almost like a software SAN, if you will. Storage area network kind of thing. Here's what's cool. You tell Kubernetes in a text file, everything's JSON these days, just get over it. You tell it in JSON, I would like 10 pods, and in each pod I would like 3 containers, and I would like those containers to be SQL Server. And it goes, okay, and you wait at the door while it goes and does all of that work. And then suddenly you've got Kubernetes, and it said, okay, I'm listening. Now you can talk to the pod, or excuse me, the cluster. You don't need to know where the pod is. The cluster does. So these things can disappear and reappear because, once again, if you lose the system but you keep the data, it just reattaches and Bob's your uncle. Does that make sense? So that's the way that kind of works. And we were talking earlier, Kubernetes has its own mechanism if something goes bad to fix it. So we told SQL, you know, that exists. So why don't we use that? And we told Kubernetes, you know, we have a thing too. So they work together, and it's very resilient. So that's Kubernetes in a nutshell. Go learn more from Ben on that. We will ride on any of those. If you have a Kubernetes somewhere in Google or Amazon or wherever or on-prem, we'll ride on it. So then what we do is we give you these things. We'll automatically update your SQL servers. We'll give you elastic scale, unified management, security, and we'll let you see it for cloud billing. You'll pay for it, even though it's on-prem, for your licenses through Azure. You get rid of the whole licensing thing, pay the fee in Azure, and you're done. Okay? This is managed instance. We do the same thing for Postgres. All right, so let's take a look here and let's recap what we got so far. SQL Server, you have all this stuff. You have all kinds of stuff. SQL Managed Instance in Azure Arc, you have almost everything except in-database machine learning services. How many of you have played with that? Python and R inside and Java and so on inside the SQL Server. Really useful feature. If you're not using it, it's not something you need. Inside Azure SQL Managed Instance, you have everything again. One more chart, which shows you the other parts. For SQL Server, you do not have limitless scalability, automatic HADR, auto upgrade, auto patching, auto backup and restore, auto monitoring, auto compliance, and guaranteed SLAs. That's on you. So if you want those things, then you would go to the other. The little half blue means it's kind of there. So we have some limitations on what we do in that feature. And then inside SQL Managed Instance by itself without Kubernetes, meaning you stay in Azure, then you have everything except the data sovereignty and customer control. What do we mean by data sovereignty? Well, in certain features, we have to put things in places that are different than where you pinned it. If we want you to be a geo-redundant, we can't always guarantee it's going to be in that data center, or you wouldn't be geo-redundant, right? Make sense? Okay. We good here on the deployment models and the choices? I know we're going through a lot. I'm going to give you a whole bunch of resources at the end. You can even go play with this. I've got a Jumpstart that a team works on. Amazing stuff. Show you everything you need to see. Yeah. This is the, see the thing. How do you deploy Azure Arc Managed Instance? You deploy Kubernetes. You connect Kubernetes to Azure. What you're going to do is you're going to install an agent in Kubernetes. It runs as a container in a pod, and it starts talking to Azure. You then tell it, hey, I'd like to deploy one of these. This can be done graphically or with AZ commands, the Azure CLI. You deploy the managed instance with a command. It brings down all of the containers and all the pods and all the nodes and everything else you need, and then you just use it, and to everything in the world, it's just SQL Server. No difference, 1433 or 1434 or whatever port you exposed, and off you go. Transact SQL, TDS layer, the whole nine. You just use it. Your app doesn't know or care. We will keep it up to date for you. We will keep it backed up for you, and we will keep it redundant for you. Everybody good with this? The process? It's way more complicated than that, but I thought this looks prettier. And I know it's after lunch, but we have docs. There's a Jumpstart right here. I'm going to not leave that up because I'm going to show you that link again in a minute. This is a little eye chart you're supposed to read, but basically these are some of the things you get. I'll let you kind of stare at that. This is what you get with Azure Data Service, Arc-enabled data services components. Wait a minute. What is this, the management? No, this is something else. People told us, okay, I like the managed instance, but I want to put some more stuff in the Kubernetes, and I want to do way more, and I want you to do a whole bunch of other stuff for us. So we have something called Azure Arc-enabled data services. We have both direct and indirect connections. That means is you can be on a ship at sea and use this. You're all in Kubernetes. We're still in Kubernetes world. You can be a ship at sea. You're not connected to Azure. And when you dock and you plug your Ethernet cable in, it gets everything, dumps everything, and out you go. Now the admin at the port can actually take a look at your SQL servers and see how things are going. Make sense? You get other things here. You can see all the things you get. This will make more sense in just a moment. I'm just going to pull these out. Here's where you would use Azure Arc-enabled data services. And this is the third Arc. So Arc number 1, a thing you put on SQL Server. Arc number 2, thank you. Arc number 2, a thing you put inside a Kubernetes to get managed instance or Postgres hyperscale. Arc-enabled data services is when you need these kinds of things. So you may be in a company. Anybody in a company where they say, we're not staying on one cloud, we're going to use lots of clouds? Anybody in there? We have a lot of folks that tell us that, say, you know, we're going to be in everybody. You know, that way we're safe. We'll see. That's an interesting way to think about it. If you've got government regulations that your data needs to be stored in country and so on. Let's think about how this works. So number 1, you deploy Kubernetes. You got to do that for all these. Secondly, you once again install the Arc Data Controller, and then we have something called the MCR, the Microsoft Container Registry. When you make these containers, the definition of them is in, you'll never guess, JSON. And those are stored in a certain place. And then they're built, and that's a binary image, and then when it's running, it's called a container. That's the way that works. Manifest, image, container. When it's running, it's a container, okay? Shameless plugs. Dinakar, this is you. You literally tweeted in the middle of my session. He says, well, I'm going to go ahead and give you the plug. Shameless plug, I'm doing 2 sessions on Azure Arc, one day today on Azure Arc Server, last session, and another deep dive on Azure SQL MI, HADR monitoring, tomorrow morning, first session. Please feel free to join. Ladies and gentlemen, Dinakar, stand up. You may as well stand up so they can see you. If we're going to, yeah. Dinakar works with me. He's an amazing human being, way smarter than me. Next thing you do is you bring down either and or SQL Managed Instance and Postgres Hyperscale. So you can actually get, if you're into that Postgres stuff, you can get it here. Then you can use kubectl and Azure CLI commands to run what you want. And we have Azure Arc resource providers that will push services down onto this environment. This is the one that Ben Weissman is going to be covering in more depth as well. So you can learn far more about that. All right. We're near the home stretch here. And by the way, once again, you just hit this with standard database tools. Management Studio, Azure Data Studio, Visual Studio Code, whatever you're using, Idera, if you're using any of that stuff, the Redgate stuff, all that works because it's just a standard layer. All right. Well, I actually say that right here. And all the SQL command tools run and everything else. Somebody asked me, and I'll go ahead and pop this question up. Somebody asked me one time, how about SQL CMD on the container that holds SQL Server inside Kubernetes? That's inside the pod. Can I get to that? You can. You actually can. You just have to know the pod it's running on, and you can query that with kubectl commands. And then you can just do a kubectl interactive terminal, IT, and get right to that pod. And then you can run SQL CMD right there. You can also copy data in and out. You can also store the data on that persistent storage, which may be on a SAN, on and on and on. Lots of ways to handle that. All right. Whenever you want to do your configuration and maintenance, you can do it from the outside, from the inside, and you get the updates automatically if you're using managed instance. That does it with the containers. We basically want to make sure it's just versionless. It's just SQL, the latest version. We normally implement features in Azure first, Azure SQL first, and then on-prem. SQL 2022, we actually did it the other way. We had some features that were in SQL on-prem before they went to Azure. So you'll see those coming in. All right. Security on the outside SQL, you use standard Kubernetes. We don't use root containers. You can use Azure RBAC. We can use an Azure SQL principal. Inside SQL, you can use SQL auth, standard SQL permissions, TLS, TDE, and always encrypted are available. For performance, we're not seeing a significant degradation depending on the hardware you have. If you don't run fast in Kubernetes, we won't run fast either. We also have all kinds of things like point-in-time restore, copy-only backups, and so on. We want to make sure that later we'd like to be able for you to lift and shift back and forth between Azure. But you do own backing up Kubernetes yourself. We do work with the built-in HA and power of Kubernetes, but we also have business-critical workloads and distributed availability groups. That's in preview right now. This talks a little bit more about that. Ben's going to cover this in more depth, so I'm going to move on past this slide. All right. We have a place for you to do this. It's called the Azure Arc Jumpstart GitHub repository. And this is the thing that will just walk you through everything. There's all kind of training there. There's free downloads and so on. So let me go. I'm going to leave this. Take a picture of the screen. You'll want the QR code to say this was the best session you've ever been in your life. And then I've got all kinds of free training for you for all of this, but grab those tiny URLs over there. We have learning. We have a Microsoft Learn module that Bob Ward and I built, and then there's this Azure Arc Jumpstart. Definitely check that out. It's really well done. Lots of folks. In the last couple of minutes, we have any questions that we have either online. Do I have any online questions, sir? All good here? In the room, are we good? Was this useful? Did you find this information useful? Whether you're going to use it or not. You have a question, sir? Yes, sir. Right. Yeah. So the question, it revolves around connecting, and I'm going to give this one to you. I'm going to have him talk to you outside the room. It's a little more complicated than what you're asking. But the question revolves around, and we can post the question somewhere and make sure you guys online see it. But the question revolves around how you now have to refer to this box that you're using inside managed instance. Now you end up with a fully qualified domain name, an FQDN, which is different. Can we just talk to the listener? Do we have to talk to the fully qualified domain? We've got to find it. You got to type all this in and so on. So he can talk to you more about how you can solve that problem. Great question. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes. Yeah, great question. Asking the real questions here. She's asked, what does ARC mean? What does ARC mean? Does it mean anything? Okay, it doesn't mean anything, so I'm going to say it's the Azure Resource Compendium. It means nothing. It means, I made that up. Don't tell marketing. All right, that's all we have time for today. Definitely check out Dinakar's session. Ben Weissman, or Weissman, if you know how to speak German, go see him. He's amazing, very smart gentleman. Dinakar also incredibly intelligent. Yes, sir. How do we get the slides? I'm going to post the PDFs to Bits, and they put them in a Get Your Slides thing. I don't control that. But I will have these as a PDF with the notes for you. Thank you all for coming. Hopefully it was useful.